Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Session Share, the Coaches Podcast. My name's Craig Birtwistle, and I'm very excited to have Tom Byer as our guest today. Tom is a best-selling author of Football Starts at Home and is a world-renowned educator in soccer youth development. How are you doing today, Tom?
Very good, Craig. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Tom, let's get started by, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What got you interested in football?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm coming to you from my living room in Tokyo, Japan. I'm originally from New York, born in New York City in the Bronx, and then my family moved upstate about an hour and a half, 2 hours north of the city. I got involved in football or soccer, as we call it in America, because my brother first started playing, which is more often the case with lots of families. I have an older brother who's a couple of years older than me, and it was just the kind of luck of the draw that one of the close families that we associated with that had five brothers, they were all very athletic. And the oldest brother, Bernie, the Schaefer family, they're pretty well known from where we're upstate New York, was into soccer, which got us interested in it. So that's really how I got exposed to it, and then the rest kind of took off.
Fantastic. So I've been following you for ages on Twitter, or X as it's now known, and I've been fascinated by your opinions and general take on player development. You often use a quote from Man United's legend Roy Keane when talking about practicing from home. The
hmm
quote for our listeners was, "Skill was and never will be a result of coaching. It's a love affair between the child and the ball." Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, I think what I've found over my career is that football in general and football development, what separates country by country isn't necessarily in the traditional sense the way everybody believed it would to be, which is coaching, coaches' education, curriculums, elite player pathways. So I started to really kind of understand the importance of culture. And I love the quote by Roy Keane because, and he's completely right. I mean, technical skills of a player is rarely the result of the coaching. It's a love affair between child and ball. So I've studied many countries around the world, specifically the countries that develop the best players in the world, which arguably were probably the Latin countries. And I started to see that the common thread was they didn't really have better coaching, better coaches' education, better curriculums, better elite player pathways, or even better facilities. They had a culture of development that started way earlier than the rest. And it started sometimes as early as a child starts to walk. So I started to see that culture, and in particular, parents, and we even zeroed down, drilled even more, fathers. Of course, in America, we've got a huge, populace of women and girls that play. But in a lot of the Latin countries, more often than not, you find that Latin fathers will use football or soccer as a tool to bond with their kids. So they're getting this tremendous head start, which is very important because obviously we play soccer with our feet, and it's a Herculean task for a small child to try to control an object with their feet from a very, very young age. So it does take a head start. So that's really, and then I came across that quote from Roy Keane. He wasn't never my most famous, my most favorite player in the world because he's not really known for his brilliant technical ability, more the kind of the enforcer. But I love the statement, and to this day, where I found it several years ago, it features in my presentations that I do around the world.
It's fantastic. And just kind of like an ad lib on what you just said there. One of the things that fascinate me is about the fact that you've learned from so many different cultures. And I feel like the world is of soccer is getting so much smaller now that everyone's trying to emulate one type of style of play. And I I feel that I used to love as I grew up the World Cup. I thought it was fascinating where you saw like the Italians that were very defensive, the Brazilians that were very flair orientated, Spanish kept possession, German were counter attacking, all these different things. How do you think football is shaping now? The fact that the world is getting so much smaller, and for example, we can have a podcast from America to Tokyo just as quick as that. How is that altering development now at the fact that are we all just becoming the same?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. And I think there's a plus and a minus. You can look at the pros and the cons for that. The pros is that there's a lot of information that gets shared. Um, I think the cons or the negative is that not everything fits in a particular silo, so to speak. So you're exactly right. Some people, if they're Barcelona fans or Pep Guardiola fans, they want to play the Spanish tiki taka way, it's funny because you're right, and especially those countries that you noted, they have very distinct cultures. The Italians, the Spanish, the Brits, the Germans, they're all different. And I kind of look at it as, the Spanish are kind of kill the bull or be killed by the bull.
Right.
It's the tiki taka where they pass it around amongst themselves, and then all of a sudden the killer pass comes through, and they've broken a line and they're through. Or if you look at the way that the Italians play, the Italians are the gladiators, right? Keep everybody out, the strength. And that's where, in the 70s and 80s, where they became renowned at defending and playing that style of ball. And then with the Brazilians as well, it's a kind of freedom with no responsibility. It almost looks like they're kind of drunken with skill. So yeah, it's big, and everybody can kind of pick what they like from different cultures and different philosophies, methodologies. But you have to be careful because not everything transfers into another culture. So, for example, here in Japan, the culture is such that when a child joins a football team at the age of 6, basically globally, when you're 6 years of age, first grade is where you enter into organized football. I know that some countries and places have these like mighty mites or whatever you want to call them at 3, 4, 5. But for over for regulating the game, officiating or oversight, basically it's 6. So in Japan, if you're a Japanese family, you'll accept that if your 6-year-old joins a team, he or she will train a minimum of 4 times a week, literally sometimes 3 hours a day, and they play all year long here. So there's no on-off season. So you could literally go 52 weeks. We don't, but it's basically you get some time off, but it's a pretty hectic schedule here. Wow, most Americans would never allow that their little 6-year-old is going to train 4 times a week for 3 hours a day, and 52 weeks a year. So these are cultural things. Here in Japan, there's a sense of community responsibility. So there's no pay to play model here, basically. I mean, most of the club teams or all of the under 12s are run by nonprofits, volunteer, inexperienced fathers and mothers that basically administer the game. And as you know, in America, it's extremely expensive sport. So there's different things that go on. And then when you have different cultures, then you have different problems. You have different ways of solving those problems. And so it goes around and around and around. But I think it's a good thing that we can all share the information. But I think you have to be very skilled at trying to understand what is it that you pick up from these different countries or different cultures or different clubs or different philosophies or methods of implementing it. I don't think there's a one size fits all. So that's where I think that countries have to develop their own style, their own culture of development. And so here in Japan, we've been very successful to really create a culture of development that values the importance of ball mastery. So if you look at Japanese players, and they're probably some of the most sought after players in the world right now. We're being literally almost raided by the European clubs these days because our players are so good technically. And so when you can close that gap between the very best and the worst players, that's where the magic happens because your elite player pool explodes. And you've got a huge player pool. So now the Europeans, there's no secret now here, they're all coming here, and we've got players playing in every major league around the world. So, yeah, culture is good. It's great to be able to exchange this information, but you have to know how to use it, I think, and fit it into your culture, whether it's development, whether it's whatever it is. It's not just even sports.
And when you say about like fitting it in the issue, using the culture, using the different styles of play that every country do, talk to us about how those cultures and that style of play and the fact that you've traveled all over the globe teaching this beautiful game, how has that shaped your coaching philosophy?
Yeah, it's good. Another good question. Well, first of all, I was really greatly influenced by the work of the Dutchman Will Curver. So I consider myself a technical specialist. That's where I have zeroed in on, and it is a specialty, because teaching technique is much different than just teaching traditional coaching. I really kind of, you've got traditional coaching, where you've got a group of young players or whatever players that you have, boys, girls, men, or women, and you've got a season to play. So you've got to prepare. You've got to decide what players are going to play what positions. What's your tactic going to be? What's your how you going to attack? How you going to defend? All of that, right? But I basically focused in on really trying to improve individual technical skills. And so that's my baseline. That's how I see a lot of the game. When I watch a game, I'm usually watching at the moments of the technical skills. Whereas other coaches would be looking at, okay, the tactics that they're playing, how are they attacking, how are they, just all of that, right? So that really has kind of influenced a lot of my career, because, and if you think about it, technique is the foundation upon which you build all the other parts or the other components of the game. And so if you don't get the technical component right, you're always kind of swimming upstream. And that's my argument always, is that we don't focus enough on the technical skill development side. So once a child, it's like in education, right? If your child comes home with D's and F's in math, science, geography, or whatever it is, what do you do? Well, probably the parent is going to hire a tutor, or maybe they're going to stay after school, or maybe the mom and dad is going to help with the homework. That's how we look at education. If a kid isn't cutting it in a soccer team, they still just keep going up the rung. We don't really do anything about it. And once they pass that window of technical skill development, they lose the ability to really express themselves. So, regardless of what tactic, system, or formation a coach is going to try to deploy, it's always going to be dependent upon the individual skills or the individual quality of the players that you have available. So I'm really focused, laser focused on the technical component. But certain countries develop better technical players, and again, I don't think that that's because they have better coaching. It's because they have a culture of development that's very conducive to developing players, because it starts way earlier. So football is one of these sports that, unfortunately, it takes a ridiculous amount of time to practice to become good, because we're using our feet. I've seen, having grown up in America, in New York, I've seen kids in school that have started to play, varsity American football, and that go on to get scholarships in colleges, or, in America, you don't really start football until high school in the olden days. I mean, it's probably a little bit different now, but these are ball and hand-eye coordinated skills that transfer. Those skill sets will transfer to another sport. If you're pretty good at certain ball games, that's going to help you in the other sports. Okay. But with football, we don't have that luxury, because there's no other sport that depends upon controlling objects with your feet at high speed with little time to react. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, it is down to culture. But when I look around and I see that the best countries in the world that develop the best players, they usually have this kind of army of players who are skilled at ball masteries. They're very good at controlling the ball. Technique really has no culture. It has no style. There's no way to stop and start, or cut with a ball, or step right and go left. It's pretty much the same. Where you get into to culture, styles, philosophies, methods, is more on the non-technical side, right? How do we organize? How do we defend? How do we attack? What's the system that we put? Do we play with one striker, two striker, all of that? But it's all dependent upon having technically skilled players. And Pep Guardiola, who I'm a big fan of. It's kind of funny because I've never really been a big fan of Barcelona, and what a contradiction. But I'm a fan of Pep. That's probably a whole different podcast. But he said it, and people got carried away because they saw you. The style and the way that you play is going to be dependent upon the players that you have available, right? So what I think happened is that because that generation of Barcelona players that they just want everything, right? I mean, it was just like on autopilot. And then a lot of youth coaches try to copy that, and trying to teach 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds the tiki taka how to pass when they haven't learned how to transfer the ball from the right foot to the left yet. They haven't learned how to even beat a standing cone and get around it without knocking it over, or to do a simple 1-2 pass or any of that. So I'm really opposed to that idea of not getting the technical component right and trying to figure out how to do that later, because it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work, and I think it shows because a majority of kids who play football globally technically poor. Most of them are.
We're actually seeing it as well. Excuse me. We're actually seeing it as well in the Premier League at the moment, where it's like everyone has to play out from the back, for example, regardless of the talent involved. Like I've seen Southampton attempt it multiple times this season already, conceding goals from playing out the back just because they're technically not good enough to do it.
Yeah.
But now, like I mentioned earlier, about how culture seems to be changing the game and everyone's style of play seems to be merging into it because it's considered not cool to play direct. But like it's all about the decision making for me. And obviously, when, as you mentioned earlier, technique will dictate what you can do tactically. So it's extremely important for our young players to concentrate on their technique. So later on in their careers, or not really careers, but when they get older, that they can implement those tactics.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And you're right. There's kind of what happens is that certain countries have dominated when it comes to football academia. The Dutch, obviously, hence the whole playing out of the back. And the whole playing out of the back was, you know, it's so funny because how things evolve over the decades, and how, if you understand football education and football coaching, and which there's an obsession of, which drives me kind of nuts, because I know and I've seen here in Japan that coaching is not so advanced or sophisticated at the youth level here in Japan. Yet we develop armies of technically skilled players. Hence the Roy Keane, skill was and never will be the result of coaching. It's a love affair between child and ball. So there's a culture here that values practicing on your own, technical skill. You've never arrived here at your destination in Japanese way and culture and thinking. It's all about the journey. It's all about the practice. Even when our women won the World Cup in 2011, they were so humble and bowing their head and saying, we still have a lot of work to do. And so it's culture. Right? It's just dependent upon, what culture you're living in or that you're working in. But I think what happened is that the Dutch were really obsessed with this playing out of the back, because not so much because they thought they were going to win games. It was, I think, because they knew that at the youngest ages, it wasn't a good thing to just boot the ball up because nobody would get to touch the ball. Hence, they wouldn't develop technical skills, but not so much as a tactical reason of why they were playing out of the back. It was a reason because they didn't want to depend upon only one or two good players up on the top and just boot the ball to them. But everybody believes that that's actually their tactic or strategy for moving the ball around. Yeah, it could be, but as you know, as you just said, unless you have those skillful players in the back, and occasionally we'll see the nightmare, right? The nightmare where the right back or the left back knocks the ball back to the goalkeeper and he misses it and it goes in the goal, or he just fumbles it. But yeah, it's understanding where these things came from. And then you could almost relate that to the rondos, right? The fascination with rondos with Barcelona. And now, 6 and 7 year olds just constantly going and playing with the rondos, not even really understanding what rondos are and what the purpose are. And it really depends upon, what it is, the point that you're trying to really focus on. What part of the field are you doing a rondo on? What, making it game related. It's misunderstood because there's just such a fascination and obsession with coaches education, and that really kind of drives me crazy because the reality is that these coaches have inherited players of vastly different abilities that aren't good technically. And so I just wrote something about it and put it on LinkedIn recently as well, that when you've got a little 6, 7, 8 year old, so you've got the one group or kids that are very good technically, they don't need traditional coaching at the traditional sense. Just set up and let them play. And then that's the old kind of cliche, the European centric of just let them play. The game's the teacher, the ball's the teacher. Yeah, it happens with kids that are technically sound because then they can start learning game intelligence. They can start being more creative. They can start doing much more. They can take risks and they enjoy it more. Versus the kid that doesn't have the technical ability, who needs the traditional coaching. You need to isolate it. You need to give them less pressure while they're trying to. It's more of a repetition. It's exercises to just teach them, coordination and motor skill development. So if you're a coach or a volunteer, inexperienced dad or mom, and you inherit 20 little 8 year olds, and a couple of them are pretty good, and the other 16 or 17 have never touched the ball, what kind of training do you put up? Now, in those traditional football countries, and especially in the Latin countries, yeah, in Brazil, Argentina, no, they don't need the traditional coaching. Really interesting. There's a friend of mine who was just here visiting recently in Japan. He has a pretty popular podcast himself in the States, and he's from Brazil. And he was telling me that one of the reasons his philosophy is that why the Brazilian, if you look at the difference between Brazilians and Argentinians in the culture, just not football. Let's just look at music. Samba, samba. It's an expression. You can samba one person. Okay? You can just put the music on and off you go. The Argentinians tango. It takes two to tango. It's very choreographed. They move in the same way. So when you start to understand these cultures, so what he was telling me was, and it's interesting, is that football is like samba dancing. So they know that the players that show up are very, very creative. They're very, technically they're very good. They're drunken with skill, what I like to call them, right? So they don't need a lot of coaching. Just let them play. So they don't really believe it. Just express them. Just let them go off. So not a lot of coaching goes on. And if you think about it, I mean, when it comes to the coaching side of football, there's not a lot of Brazilian football coaches that are applying their skills, whether it's the Premier League, whether it's in the Spanish League, whether it's in the Bundesliga, it's in any of these leagues. So they don't seem to be excelling at that very high level of coaching. Versus you've got many more, probably more Argentinians, right? Bielsa, you got Pochettino. There's lots more. So again, it's interesting, the culture piece of looking at it and understanding how culture impacts sport and just about everything else.
Love that. It's all fascinating stuff. Todd, we're going to be back after a short message from Zencaster. Do you have a story to tell that the world needs to hear? Have you struggled with reaching new audiences who are engaged with your story? It might be time for you to start a podcast. Let me tell you about a platform we use here at Session Share. Zencaster makes it super easy to produce a high quality broadcast with 4K video recording from your phone and AI editing that automatically removes ums, ahs, you knows, and 22 other speech patterns. Zencaster makes it super easy to produce a podcast that sounds great. Ready to tell your story? Check out the link in the show description to learn more about Zencaster. Welcome back, and we're going to go into a bit more detail on coaching and player development. As I mentioned earlier, you speak very highly of the work being done in Japan about how the gap between the J League is closing in on other major leagues and how top English clubs are now raiding the J League for talent. Can you tell us a little bit more of this transition that you've seen by the way of the Japanese FA as implemented on their curriculum, style of play, etc., that has helped them so much with their player development?
Yeah, there's a little bit to unpack here. These are great questions. I wouldn't necessarily identify the JFA as having been the biggest game changing agent. And that's a really important part to understand, that there's a limit to what federations, even professional teams and clubs can do. And so I came here in the 1980s. I got into my entree into football here was playing for a team here, Hitachi, which was not in the J League. For the listeners, J League, the professional league started in 1993. I came in the 80s, and we had what was called the JFL. All the teams, even today, are owned and backed by massive corporations: Yamaha, Hitachi, Nissan, Toyota, all of them. And so I've seen that journey over close to 40 years, and I also seen the journey of player development and understand the journey between grassroots and national teams, right? So I think what's happened here, I've seen the transformation of this kind of technical revolution, and I can speak about this intimately because I've been involved in it. So without trying to sound too egotistical, I know what I know because I've done it. I was part of it. So I have and also I was an outsider, so I have a very unique perspective to it as well. And so we were able to introduce this whole concept of focusing on technical skill development, but not in the traditional sense. It didn't come by way of influencing the JFA with their coaches' education or even the professional clubs. We utilized and we leveraged very successfully pop culture here. I had come in contact and had been exposed to the work of Will Curver, the Dutchman, and which is, if for people who don't know, most coaches around the world know him. He's really credited as really being the pioneer of individual technical skill development. He's Dutch. He's passed away a few years ago, but world renowned. And I brought his philosophy and methodology here to Japan, and I really wanted to kind of create a movement here. And so when you create a movement, you need a way to build the advocacy, build the awareness, deliver the message. And so back in those days, which was the early 1990s, um, was trying to figure out, well, how do we get this message out there? So basically, it was trial by error. Um, I'm probably most known for my media presence here because I was casted on Japan's number one television show for children back in the 1990s that was produced and created for Pokemon. So Pokemon is enormous. It started and originated from here, the creation, and then exported globally. But I was casted on the number one TV show that was born out of that. So it's not a football or soccer show. It's a pop culture about Pokemon. But there was a corner in there in the in the beginning of the show, and it was the number one show in the country for kids in the early morning show. So I was presenting this 1 point lesson, focusing on ball mastery, 1v1, change of directions, moves to beat opponents, stops and start, everything. And that complemented, I was already traveling around the country conducting what we call these soccer clinics or events. So I'm going around we've got 47 states here in Japan, 48 actually, sorry, 48 states here, 47. Sorry, Tokyo's kind of included as well. But I was traveling around and doing these enormous events. So then I started implementing this technical curriculum into my events. Then we started focusing on commercial soccer schools that were all focused on technical skill development. Then after casted on the TV show, part of the set was I had a 2-page layout in Japan's number one comic book, Koro Koro Comic, which is 1.3 million copies per month. Super, super popular here. So I had 2 pages in that. Then we had 2 pages in Soccer Digest magazine, the number one magazine for soccer. So everywhere you looked, and then we created VHS videos around it, DVDs. Today that would be um, apps, perhaps. So we had this unbelievable matrix of delivery and it was a very, very simple message. You want to be a good soccer player, it starts with the technical component. It wouldn't be until years later the JFA would see that this was very popular that they would actually invite us in, and we started doing some coaches education designed specifically only on technical skill development. And we had another guy here who was focused mostly on coaches education that would go and he'd be part of like their licensing course. He'd go for like 1 or 2 days and we'd do just purely a technical thing. So it became very popular because we became so big and popular that we couldn't be ignored. But in the beginning, we weren't embraced by the federation or the professionals or anybody. So, and I think that's a very, very good example of how you can create and you can bring change to a country in a non-traditional way. So if you've got the federation and the state associations behind you, yeah, surely it's going to supercharge it. But you need to be able to reach as many people as possible. So what I do now, fast forward, and I go around the world and I'm leaving. I was just in Korea a couple of weeks ago presenting to all 47 member associations that make up our AFC, Asian Football Confederation. And I gave a presentation. And every presentation I go, there's one slide that shows and represents how we created the movement and the delivery channels on how we did that: pop culture, television, comic books, uh, 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 in-person events, building advocacy, creating content through video, online, offline, just all of newspapers, all of that, and show how, because it, regardless of what it is you're trying to promote, if you don't have the ability to build the awareness and take it to mass numbers, then you can't create a movement. And so that's part of what we do when we go around the world. I'm on my way to Malaysia on Monday to speak at their conference for hundreds and hundreds of coaches and stakeholders. So everybody wants to kind of know, well, what's happening in Japan? And what happens is that here in Japan, people come here because Japan is the gold bar standard for Asia, for most part. So they all come here and they arrive here and they go to visit the JFA, they go to visit the J League, and they come away a little bit disappointed because they're not still figuring out what it is that, for example, I'm actually talking about. Because when you go to an FA, they will just focus on their world. And what is their world? Governance, coaches education, elite player development. That's their mantra. So you'll go there and you'll hear from an instructor about how they've got 47 states and how we've got training centers, national training centers, and we have elite player development, and we have more coaches with A licenses, B licenses, blah, blah, blah. And then that's it. You go to the J League, and the J League will say, yeah, we're the ones doing all the work. We've got 60 teams, 3-tiered, promotion, relegation. We have academies, boom, boom, boom. And then they don't hear the stuff about the TV shows. They don't hear the stuff about the technical skill development. They don't hear the stuff about right now, currently, 5 of our national team players, including the captain that plays at Liverpool, Endo, they all come from our schools. So they all got that head start. They all focused and they're all well known for their technical skill development. Our women are the biggest outlier country in the entire world until Spain just won I think it was the Senior World Cup or the Under 20. I can't keep track because they're so often. But Japan was the only country in the world that won all 3 FIFA World Cup tournaments, man. They won the seniors, the under 17s, and the under 20s. And why that's really interesting is because we have such a small player pool of girls here. 30,000 registered players here in Japan. And we won those 3 FIFA World Cup tournaments in the space of 7 years. Okay. So why? Why? Because basically the entry level is focused on skill development, ball mastery. And at the youngest ages, usually technique will win at the youngest ages. It gets different when they get older. It's much more physical, speed, just everything. Tactics come into it, coaching comes into it. But at the youngest ages, technique seems to be the key. So Japan is always qualifying for the under 17s, under 20s, always going to at least the knockout stage, and usually the best 4 or usually the final at those age groups. So if you look at that and you understand, well, what's happening, then you'll understand that the underlying factor for here in Japan is that it's the emphasis on the technical component. So if you get all the other parts wrong in football, but you've got a massive pool of players that are really good technically, you'll always be competitive.
It sounds like to me that Japan was kind of that sweet spot. You found a country that was willing to change, but also had that night to want to improve. Whereas, like, I look at my country, England, I look at my adopted country, America, and I feel like there can be some sense of arrogance there that it has to be done a certain way, or the fact that because I've watched the game my whole life, I know how to coach it, even though technically you probably don't. So, would you say that was a fair estimate? How would you go about, say, fixing America?
So you hit a great point, and I'll tell you exactly. I'll phrase it in a different way, and I always say this to everybody because I'm very blessed to travel around the world. It's easier for me to work in a country with no football culture than it is to work in a country with the wrong football culture. So that's what you have. You've got lots of pockets of places where there's outside influence. You look at America. America has always been this country that, and a lot of other countries as well, where they feel like they've got to hold the hand of the foreign experts. Look at the makeup of the U.S. soccer coaches education department. They're not Americans. It's always they always hire. Usually, they'll hire the experts from Europe because they believe that Europe has a monopoly on football development and education. That's it. Look at the MLS. We've had over 30 years of MLS, so you've had three generations. You'll find mostly in a lot of the MLS clubs the heads of methodology, the heads of coach. They're usually not Americans; they're foreigners. And same thing here in Asia. But here's some insights that I see. Here in Asia, the two, especially in East Asia, the two strongest countries in Asia are Japan and Korea. We have absolutely no foreign experts working in the federations in either of those countries. Occasionally, the KFA will hire a foreign technical director, but never in Japan. There has never been in the history of Japanese football a foreign coaches educator head of it, foreign of like in charge of elite player development or technical director or any key position. At the top national team, yes, have experimented with foreign coaches, but never with an under 20 team or an under 7 team ever. And so here, this is what I put out to the listeners. So if you study and you understand, there's 211 member association countries that make up FIFA. 211. Out of those 211, I'm talking in the context of men's. Out of 211, there's only 8 countries that have won a World Cup tournament. I think I might have mentioned them, but Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, and England. That's it. Now, no country has ever won a World Cup tournament with a foreign coach. Ever. Never. And out of the 8 World Cup champions, only one or two, England, the main one, has experimented with a foreign coach. England was Sven Eriksson and Capello, I believe, right? So to me, what does that say? That tells me that culture rules. That tells me that probably native coaches connect better with native players. Can you? I can't imagine Brazil or Argentina going with a foreign coach, or the Italians, or the French, or the Germans. Never say never. And then here's another one, a little bit of trivia. No country today in modern day has won a World Cup tournament that doesn't border another country that's won a World Cup tournament, with the exception of England. But if we consider the English Channel a border, they border as well. So when you look at the other countries that are knocking on the door to win, they all border other World Cup countries: Belgium, Croatia. So these are things that I think that you have to at least pay attention to and understand. In Japan, here, the best that the national team has done is usually with the Japanese coaches here. And so anyway, that's am I right? Maybe, maybe not, but I think it's something to think about. To think about. And again, it's culture because what is culture? Culture is when a community, a family, a company, an organization, a country, they share the same beliefs and values. They share the same music, the same food, the same language, the same fashion. It's all the same, right? So for football, I think that what are those beliefs and values? Well, I believe that ball mastery should be at the center of development, you know? And so, if you can get everybody moving in the same direction and believing that as well, Japan's not a football culture. They're the furthest from a football culture. You're not going to get into a taxi anywhere in Tokyo and have some guy, angry because FC Tokyo they lost over the weekend, and they think that the coach deployed the wrong tactic or the wrong formation or system or didn't play, this guy versus that guy, but you'll get that in Rome or in England or in some of these other football countries. So it's a different world, man. It's a different world where, 24 hours a day, people are talking about football, football. I was just recently in the summertime, I was in Europe and I was at Dinamo Zagreb. My son was actually training there. And on the day or the weekend where there's a game, there's a vibe, there's an energy. There's same thing in Ajax too. I was over at Ajax as well in the summertime. It's just you don't have that in most countries in the world. So there are some countries that are just super super strong culturally, and that helps the development side as well. There's a big thing now. America has always had this supremacy in women's football, right? And I'm not so sure it's because we were so much better than everybody else, but we got a huge head start because of lots of things, right? But now, when you look now at the even in England, your own your home home ground, right, homeland. When you look at the English girls, they seem to sometimes be more tactically intelligent or more tactically aware than the American girls. Why? They're immersed in a football culture. On the weekend, it's much more common that they'll be sitting at the dining room table and the game will be on and everybody will be talking about it. So they're hearing about tactics, systems, the grandfather, the uncle, the brother, whoever it is. You don't get that in America. Most girls, and even in Japan too, most don't watch football on TV regularly. They play, it's a participation sport. And you can see it, man. You can see it. Look at the giant leap forward that European women have made in football, man. Spain, right? England as well, French as well. And so you have to understand that when you're trying to devise a strategy for player development. Well, what works, what doesn't. But everybody always defaults to the traditional coaching. We need more coaches. We need more coaches education. We need to have the foreign experts come in and show us how to do it and hold the hand. And meanwhile, the kids just can't transfer the ball from the right foot to the left. So
Very
yeah.
true. Very true stuff. Tom, we'll be back after a short advert.
Okay.
Do you need fresh ideas for your football, soccer training? Then follow Session Share on YouTube and X. Our handles can be found in the show description. Session Share, for coaches, by coaches. Welcome back. We've just been speaking a lot about culture. And Tom, I like to finish my podcast with a bit more of a lighter note. Can you tell us what your favorite moment was in sports? It can be as a player, fan, a coach.
That's very easy. My favorite moment was my last collegiate game in the United States. I went to two colleges. I went to junior college in upstate New York, which was back in the '70s. I'm confident to say a national perennial powerhouse. We won two back-to-back national championships. Not me. I played after that, but then I went to the University of South Florida, and I played in the NCAA Division One tournament, which is the highest level in college. And we went to Duke University, which was very strong. They had won multiple national champions. They had one of the best programs in the entire country. And so we played a match there. And the captain of Duke was my former teammate at my junior college in New York. We grew up together and we're buddies, brothers. And I played right back. So it's obviously not a position where you score a lot of goals, except for that game. And
Ah,
I scored a goal in that game. And we were losing 1-0, and I scored the tying goal. But not only did I score the tying goal, but I combined with a player who turned out to be one of our great players who played for the U.S. national team, '94 World Cup, Roy Wegerle, who's South African. And we wound up losing the game, unfortunately. But I remember my dad in the stands standing up and yelling because he was amongst a couple of thousand fans and he was the only guy standing up. And I remember telling him to sit down. So that was my most memorable moment. Sorry it was centered around myself and I could have a more interesting, but I never forgot that moment of scoring that goal. And that was my last game because we got knocked out of the tournament. And then the rest was history.
I think that's a great memory, and it doesn't matter how old you get and how well you did. Your dad can always embarrass you, isn't it? That's absolutely fantastic stuff. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tom. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been so much fun, and I'm sure very beneficial to our listeners. So, Tom, if our listeners want to get in touch with you and follow you on X and everything, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, probably. I'm very active on X, formerly known as Twitter, and my handle, so to speak, is Tomsan 106. So TOMSAN 106, and I am probably pretty well known on Twitter as someone who actually replies to all inquiries if it's done in a polite way, and DMs as well. So I try to be charitable with my time. I'm also on Facebook. If you just search for Tom Byer, I have both a public page and a private page. And that's it. I dabble in Instagram, but it's not really. It's not my way of actually communicating. X's. I'm very very active on that. So come and join, and look forward to interacting with whomever.
And what we'll do as well for our listeners, in the podcast description, I will leave all Tom's information where you can get in touch with him, follow him on X and everything. I do thoroughly enjoy his tweets. I don't know if you call them tweets anymore, but we'll say tweets.
That's right.
So, yeah. So, well, that's about it for the time we have on this episode of Session Share, the Coaches Podcast. Thank you again, Tom Byer, for joining us. Be sure to get in touch across all our socials to offer your opinions on all we have discussed today. You can find the social media platforms we use in our podcast description. This has been Session Share, the Coaches Podcast. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coaching the beautiful game.